Jolly House at Wakefield, Castleford, and Julia Cock will do the presentation.
Thank you, Chair. This application seeks full planning permission for a new dwelling attached to the side of number 28 Wakefield Park in Castleford. The dwelling will be located on garden land that's associated with and owned by the occupants of number 28. And new vehicle access to the dwelling also forms part of the proposal. So this is just a site plan that sort of shows you the properties outlined in red, and it shows you that the surrounding areas are predominantly residential. Pontefract Road runs runs alongside to the east, and the dwelling fronts into Wakefield Park here. This is an aerial photograph of the application site. It shows you this is the row of terrace. It's a row of terrace of 4 properties. The proposed dwelling will be located here. The next one is just a closer view of the property. And these are photographs. The first slide shows you the application site, which is here. This is number 28, and this is number 30. And the dwelling will be located on the side of number 28 in here. Same with this photograph, which shows you where the dwelling will sit at the end of number 28 here. Again, this shows you the front of the property, so number 28, the dwelling will be located in here. This is number 30. These are front elevations of number 22 to number 28 Wakefield Park. And they're all sort of designed with this sort of front projection that accommodates a garage. The next one is the rear garden of number 28. And the stick photograph this is the boundary between the application site, if you like, number 28, the application site, and number 30. This is the rear boundary of the site, so this is Pontefract Road that runs along the back. And this again is the principal elevation of the existing properties, and again it sort of shows you this projection that they have to the front that accommodates a garage. So this is the location plan and a proposed site plan. So the new dwelling is this area here, highlighted in brown. These you can just about see, maybe not so well. There's trees and shrubbery along this boundary here, the ones that I showed you on the photograph. The majority of those would need to be removed. This tree that you see here is protected by a tree preservation order, but that's unaffected by the development. There is, I understand, a right of access for number 20, the properties 22, 20 to 28. There's a right of access, I understand, although I haven't seen anything, for them to access their properties via a path that runs along the back here. That would still be maintained. You can see that anybody wanting to access the properties would go along down the side of the house and along to the backs of the properties here. So these are the top line of the existing elevations and the second line of the proposed elevations. So it shows you how the dwelling would appear in the street scene. The features of the dwellings on the terrace have been reflected in the types and the sort of size of the openings, and the property would still have this projection here, but that wouldn't accommodate a garage. That would be used as a kitchen. Moving along, again, this sort of shows you these are the floor plans. So the new property would have a kitchen area here, and the dining and the lounge area is in the rear. And at the first floor level, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. This slide just shows you, if you can see here, the trees that are outlined in green. So, the trees that are outlined in green are the ones that will remain. Trees that are marked T9 and T10 are the 2 that are protected by preservation orders, so they can't be removed or damaged at all. And then the areas around those trees in like a browny grey shade, that's the extent of the root protection area. And then the trees that you can see in red here, they would be the ones that would be removed. So moving back, if I take you back to the block plan. in the case officer's report. Briefly, issues raised relate to the negative impact on the neighbouring occupiers from the loss of trees and shrubbery along the boundary, the proximity of the development to the study window in the side elevation of the neighbouring property, overlooking from the balcony in the rear elevation, the development not being in keeping with the general appearance of the neighbourhood, the 1 metre path not providing adequate access provision to the rears of number 22, 24 and 26, the impact on on-street parking and access, overdevelopment of the site which should be retained as garden land, precedent, title deeds highlighting no more buildings on the estates, the negative impact on property values, the proposed building being smaller than the others, the impact of construction work in terms of dust, noise and general disturbance, neighbours not being given adequate time to comment, and existing covenants that exist on the property. Councillor Forster has also raised concerns and requested the application be considered by members of the committee. Again, these are detailed in the case officer's report, but briefly summarise the concerns he's raised are that the Wakefield Park estate is already intensely overdeveloped. Residents have a high level of car ownership. A further property will only add to the problem. Access to 20 to 28 Wakefield Park being restricted. The impact on number 30 by virtue of loss of light and overlooking, and the deeds which suggest no further development on land within Wakefield Park. Subject to conditions, we've received no objections from the Council's Highway Officer and no objections from the Arbor Cultural Officer, Police Architectural Liaison Officer or Yorkshire Water. So in terms of principle, the development is considered acceptable. In terms of highways, the property would provide 2 off-street parking spaces to service 2-bed dwelling and a drop curb is proposed to facilitate access to vehicles. The Highways Officer recommends conditions requiring the areas to be used by vehicles to be hard surfaced, the drop curb to be carried out to LPA specification, and requiring measures to restrict mud being deposited on the highway during the construction period. In terms of the design and the layout of the property, the proposed dwelling is slightly narrower than others within the terrace. However, the front elevation has been designed to reflect the features of neighbouring dwellings, including projection to the front and the size and design of the openings. Whilst the overall amount of limited garden space falls slightly short of the 75 square metres recommended in the RDG, distances between properties and to boundaries comply with the RDG. A condition is recommended removing PD rights for any extensions or outbuildings within the site. Whilst elements of soft landscaping will be removed along the boundary of number 30, none of that is protected and it's within the owner's remit to do. Boundary treatment forms part of the recommended conditions as do final construction materials. Concerns have been raised in relation to overlooking from the rear balcony, loss of light to the neighbouring property at number 30 and noise disturbance during construction work. The balcony to the rear, which is here, is a Juliet balcony. It's not the type of balcony that you can walk out into and stand and look. And for that reason it functions the same as any other opening. And raises no significant concerns in relation to overlooking. A condition is recommended restricting any windows in the side elevation, this elevation here, this one here, just to protect the immunity of the neighbouring occupier. The side elevation number 30, which was extended to the side back in 2008, features a window serving a study and a door serving a kitchen utility area. Whilst the proposed dwelling will reduce the distance between the two properties and will undoubtedly have an impact on light entering the study, a study is not considered a habitable room and therefore the remaining distance is considered to be acceptable. Additionally, as mentioned previously, it's worth noting that a 2-metre high wall or fence could be erected along the boundary, which would also have an effect on those openings. In terms of construction works, these will of course have an impact on neighbours for the period that they are ongoing, but given this is for a single dwelling, it's not considered that would be an extensive or unacceptable period of time. If members are minded to approve the application and feel it's appropriate, a condition could be imposed restricting the hours that construction works could be undertaken. I touched on trees earlier, but trees within the site are protected by a CPO, and for this reason, the applicant was requested to provide an arboricultural report. The report identified the trees and shrubs to be removed from the site and tree protection areas for those remaining. The Council's arboricultural officer confirmed that the trees to be lost are of low to moderate value in the wider public context, and confirmed that the larger trees subject to the CBO are to be retained and are not under threat. Conditions recommended to ensure that no construction materials are located within the root protection areas of the two protected trees. Just briefly touch on other matters. Drainage will be dealt with under building regulations. Concerns relating to the access path to the rears of 22 and 26 are noted, but an access route that's been provided here is very similar to the width that's currently provided. It's this part here. This one here. It's about a metre wide now, and it would remain a metre wide following the development. The recommendation is approval. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, two speakers registered, and the first speaker is Mrs. Johnson. You've got 3 minutes, Mrs. Johnson. Now remind you when you get to 30 seconds.
Is that okay? Is that on? Okay, I'm Catherine Johnson, and I'm here today to speak on behalf of the residents on Wakefield Park who raised many objections to the proposed build adjacent to number 28. And I'm here especially to speak for Mr. Harvey, who resides at number 30, who would like to have spoken today, but ill health, largely due to this, prevents him from being here. The small cul-de-sac where the proposed build will be is already a very busy and at times congested area, with private vehicles from the surrounding properties and also service vehicles, pharmacy deliveries, ambulances and so on supporting residents. To add to this volume of traffic will be inconsiderate to residents and would definitely compromise safety for everyone living there. One pathway adjacent to number 28 is actually a private driveway serving 6 dwellings, one of which belongs to Mr. Harvey, number 30. He would like me to make it quite clear today that he will not in any way allow construction vehicles or equipment to use his land and indeed the land along his boundary wall. A build could not take place without a large increase in traffic, and this would have a huge impact on the quality of lives and the safety in this area of Wakefield Park, and this factor must be considered very carefully. I would also like to draw to your attention to the fact that the pathway alongside number 28, as that lady has mentioned, is a right of access for the properties adjoining, which are number 22, 24 and 26, which is where I now live at 26. This pathway is essential for residents to live there safely, happily and access their property from the rear. There are so many reasons why this access is vital, from emergency services being able to attend the rear of the property, work and repairing properties, needing to carry large pieces of furniture when delivered into the property through the French doors at the rear, or possibly as access for disabled family and friends who cannot enter at the front. I appreciate this pathway remains on the proposed plan, however, at a metre wide but then surrounded by high walls on either side, I'm sure you can appreciate this would severely restrict access. I previously lived in a property opposite on number 31 Wakefield Park where the pathway was a metre wide, but it had a high wall either side of that pathway, and we had so many problems moving furniture in and out of that property and often had to dismantle furniture just to take it into the home. I would ask the committee who actually benefits from this proposed build. The applicant, yes, but the damaging effects of this build are far-reaching and would create ill feeling amongst many residents. On behalf of the objectors, I would urge the planning committee to take great care in making the right decision with regard to this application, which has the potential to create long-lasting animosity between those most closely affected. Thank you.
Are there any questions, Mrs. Johnson? Councillor Kirky?
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Johnson. the people at number 28 who are building this property, do they intend to live in it themselves, or are they going to sell it?
I'm not aware of that.
Sorry, it's not there.
Oh, we've only recently moved into the property adjacent to number 28, and I'm not certain whether she intends to live in that property or to sell it. That's not been made clear to me.
Thank you.
Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just ask, you just mentioned that you have recently moved to your property.
Yes.
So in your deed, does it mention about no further development in the area at all?
Yes, it mentions that is something that was that the precedent had been set. A precedent shouldn't be set for any further development in that area.
Councillor Bazard.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. The pathway that you're talking about, is it just a pathway for walkers, to walk around, or could you get a car around? Or?
No, you couldn't take a car down. It is a footpath, but it is used mainly for if workmen need to access the rear of the property, or if, as we say, if an ambulance or fire service needed to use that, which thankfully is rarely, but it does need to be there. The problem we have with it is because at the moment, even though it's a metre wide, you can appreciate there is grass and trees either side of it.
Yeah.
So which we did about a month ago, we carried a sofa down that pathway and across to enter our new property from the rear. Now, if that metre path is surrounded by two high walls, which one would be a boundary wall at number 30 and the property wall at number 28, there's no forgiveness in there, is there? You couldn't possibly carry a large piece of furniture through there. And I'm sure there are other circumstances where it would restrict access, whereas at the moment the pathway has land inside of it rather than buildings.
Could I just go back to that picture what we're on a minute? There, yeah. So, with the pathway there, and then it's a little footpath that goes up the side of them trees, and there, yeah, that's the footpath.
It goes through the centre of the grassed area as the pathway, and then along the back of all those 5 townhouses that adjoining.
Any further questions?
Chair, can I ask what is the approximate width at the moment of that path? So is it deemed to be just the paved part, which is if you like, the legally identified path?
Yes, I would imagine the actual pathway as such is a flag which runs through both of those garden areas and across the back. That is the pathway. It's a flag that runs through, but it's surrounded by grass and trees. Not that people step onto the garden. All I was meaning was that creates space around the pathway.
But that's technically, your right of way is simply on that paved
It's
path.
the pathway.
Yeah, thank you.
Any further questions? Councillor Bazard.
So the piece of land what we're looking at now with trees and bushes on, that belongs to number 28. Is that right? And that's where the applicant wants to put a house as well. And he owns that.
Any further questions? No? Next speaker is Councillor Foster. 3 minutes, and I'll remind you of 40 seconds.
Thank you, Chair. Members, appreciate that due to COVID restrictions, many of you may not be familiar with Wakefield Park. And I know Mrs Johnson briefly talked about the whole carter, but I'd just like to put it a little bit more in context in the whole estate. So this estate, Wakefield Park, was built on the site of a former large house. This small estate was designed by the developer in the early 70s to maximise the number of dwellings on the site. The estate comprises some 42 dwellings, some detached, and the detached small terrace and a number of flats, each flat having its own garage. So currently the properties house some 66 residents and a number of children. Most dwellings have either 1, 2 or 3 cars associated with them. As you will appreciate, to get so many dwellings on the site, most gardens are relatively small, and the distance, as Mrs Johnson pointed out, between the majority of properties is just about a metre. So consequently, when some people are moving their furniture, they have to move it over gardens because they can't get it down the side of the house. As part of the original development in the centre of the estate was a small parcel of land. The developer at that time recognised open land on the estate was very limited, so he placed a covenant on it to restrict any more properties whatsoever being built in the middle of the estate. Obviously, by doing so, he was hoping to restrict the density being made even worse over time. The only other areas of open land in this estate are at each end of this small terrace, one of which is the subject of this application today. If members do give permission for this development, it will only serve to reduce open amenity land even further and increase the density, particularly in the small cul-de-sac that Mrs Johnson has referred to in the middle of the estate. Again, as Mr Johnson has explained, this small cul-de-sac already serves 13 properties with 22 residents. Most have at least 1 car, some have 2, and throughout the day residents receive visits from care providers and other delivery drivers, which makes this little cul-de-sac extremely busy. As members will appreciate, with the density of dwellings in such a small estate, any increase in dwellings and residents will have quite an impact on the flow of traffic, and equally important, parking and the risk to any children living or playing on that estate. It's because of these facts that I ask members to refuse this application on the grounds that it will have a negative impact on the estate and residents through the loss of amenity land. Thanks, members.
Any questions for Councillor Foster? Councillor Jones first.
I want to look at this issue of the covenant, because obviously Councillor Foster did make reference to this covenant, and obviously it's in the papers. So it may well be a question to it, may well be a question that leads up, and that is, what is therefore the legal status of this covenant in terms of if there was a stipulation about the density of houses on that estate, and there's any sort of green space that should be left as per this covenant? What therefore is the legal status of the covenant in regards to the fact that, am I assuming that the proposed property is going to be built on this person's land? So it's a question of the issue of the status of the covenant. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. Well, actually, what happened, my uncle was one of the first residents to move on to Wakefield Park, and this piece of land formed the part of the back of his property, and so I spoke to the developer and asked him what he intended to do with it, and as a consequence, he said, I put a covenant on it because there are enough properties on this estate now, would you like to buy it? So my uncle purchased the property, purchased a piece of land, knowing that it could only ever be used for gardens. But my point on was that because the density of properties on that estate was so great at that time, the only bits of open land was this bit that I placed a covenant on, and the piece of green areas at the either end of the terrace. And other than that, it is all totally developed. So since my uncle passed away, the land has been kept for gardens, and it's been shared by the 2 neighbours, but it at no stage, and it's been stipulated in their transfer deeds, because one of them's a close friend of mine, that they cannot build on that property, on that piece of land.
Do you want me to jump in there?
I think this is quite a
An important point, yeah. You probably know the answer to it as an experienced member of the planning committee. But private interests are not relevant planning issues. So restrictive covenants, rights of way, per se, restrictive covenants, that sort of thing, they're matters between the parties. They're not relevant to the determination of the planning application. What I would say as a general principle is that When you get planning permission, it's effectively a piece of paper enabling you to do something under the planning regime. Whether you can actually implement it is another matter, because you get that piece of paper, all bounds, restricted covenants, rights of way, or whatever, which the people who have the benefit of those covenants or rights of way might be able to enforce. I haven't seen any of the documentation, and why would I? Because they're not relevant planning issues. So it's straightforward, really.
I think that might be.
Yeah. Having said that, sometimes you might say, well, if there's all these other issues in the background, private interest, it's all very well as giving a planning permission to someone, but are they going to be able to deliver it? Well, I would say in this particular case, if you were the beneficiary of the planning permission, you could actually negotiate with those who have the benefit of the restricted covenants or the rights of way to actually release them in order to carry out the development. So, in terms of deliverability, I don't think that's a great issue in this particular case. So that's the situation.
Thank you.
Councillor Harvey?
Thank you, Chair. Probably just follow on Kerry's advice. Councillor Foster, are you aware how long the applicant has been residing at 28 Wakefield Park?
No, not actually, because I know it was a mother that moved in before her, so I knew a mother, but I'm not sure how long she's been living there. It's quite, I think the mother went in at the time, my uncle went in, so probably early 70s, and then she moved in a number of years after.
Thank you. Just want to make sure that maybe this, he or she will be aware of that covenant itself. Thank you.
Just got a quick one here, because I'm just looking at the little map I've got here. What I was going to say. Can I just ask if this is right? Because on our little map here, we've got 28-20 and number 20. You say there were grass area each side and it couldn't be built on. On mine, it looks like number 20 is on the side extension, which took it right to boundary. No, I mean number 20, because it's a block of terrace, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's number 30.
No, this one.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mention.
Yeah. On that terrace as it stands now, we've got 28-20. And you were saying that there were grass at each side of the terraces. Well, on mine, I don't know if members are the same as me, but it looks like there's been an extension built on number 20 on this side, right to the boundary, which would stop an access that way without access.
Chair, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that bit at that end, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, that's just, well, I'm just saying, there were grass either way around both ends of the terrace for you to walk around 1 hour, it looks like it's dead into the boundary.
As I understand it, I appreciate there is something on the side of that property there, that the access at that end of the townhouses was a pathway that ran along initially from the entrance to Wakefield Park, because there are flats there alongside the end, and the pathway wasn't down the side of number 20, it came in from the entrance to Wakefield Park and ran right along the back there.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that the access was down the side, as far as I'm aware of number 20. It came in from the edge of the development and ran right behind the flats and then along the back of those townhouses.
I just really thought we were going on. Any further questions? Councillor Haynes?
Chair, thank you. This question is for the planning officer, if that's okay. I'll let you on. Policy CS3, it states on page 91, the net requirement for density is 40 per hectare. This particular development will raise the number to 54. It doesn't indicate what the ideal number is. Moving up to 54, is there many more developments within that Castle area with a density of 54? Or are they below that? And a lot below it all?
sort of types of dwellings that are built. You can have an area of terrace properties, which you can sort of say, if you look on here, you can have an area of terrace properties where the density will be higher, and then you can have an area perhaps where, 4 or 5 bed houses are built, and the density is less. So it's not, you're right, it doesn't give an ideal figure of what the density should be. What we have to sort of consider here is one more dwelling makes that much difference to the density of the area.
There seems to be some issue surrounding density in this particular case, from what these people have said. They've said that the density brings other problems because we're talking nowadays, with house building, we're talking 2 cars. I don't know how many children we're talking, but we're talking 2 cars. So density brings, it's such a, I mean, I've been down to Wakefield Park and had a look, and it's such a small, confined area, there's even turning issues when you get to the very bottom of it. So when you put a statement like this in, that you would be looking for 40, this one is 54, do you think we're stretching the boundaries there? You know?
I think the addition of one house isn't stretching the, I wouldn't say that the addition of one house is stretching the boundary of the density to an unacceptable level. And you're right, it does, you know, an additional dwelling does have an impact on other things such as parking, that type of thing. But this is a 2-bed property, it's providing 2 off-street car parking spaces. So I personally, as an officer, my view is that one additional dwelling wouldn't make the density of the area an unacceptable level that would warrant refusing the application.
There's another item that's sort of related to that. We move on to the next page, and they're talking about the amenity space provided. And apparently, in this particular case, they would expect 68, and there's a shortfall of 7 square metres. So that's sort of indicating that this dwelling is going to be compromised on the amount of amenity space it's got, which is all relevant to what they're actually trying to do. They're actually trying to shoehorn a property into somewhere where it doesn't really fit. So are we sort of bending the rules slightly by saying a shortfall of 7 metres is acceptable?
No, we're acknowledging that the garden, the amenity space with the property, the recommended amount of amenity space is 75 square metres, and this would only have 68 square metres. And that is, if you like, if you weigh things in the balance, that's a negative. But as officers, it's the detail in the RDG of their guidance and their recommendations. We don't feel that the deficit in the amount of amenity space is sufficient to warrant refusal. Members may well take a different view. You may feel that the house is being shoehorned in and that the amenity space isn't sufficient. But you'll have a lot of properties in Castleford, probably some of these up here, that won't have 75 square metres. It's a row of terrace properties. We feel that, again, it doesn't warrant refusal. You may take a different view.
I just let George Jones.
It's definitely not working that line. I just wanted to clarify, as Julie pointed out, it is a balancing issue for members to consider. And Councillor Foster has explained the density issue from the 1970s. But we do know that densities do change, and government guidance does change on what is an acceptable density of housing. And as the land for housing becomes in shorter supply, the density per number of units has gone up. So the standards of the 1970s might not be relevant to today's density standards, and you have to balance all those things when you look at assessing an application like this, as well as Julie has pointed out, the quality of the housing stock in the area, what makes up that character, what garden spaces they have, what are the distances around them, and what is the material planning norm.
Councillor?
Yeah, I mean, my own opinion personally is that the key issue is the traffic congestion around that turning head, but
I don't think I need any further guidance on that one. On this issue of the status of the piece of land, towards the beginning of the report, it starts off by saying, and I'm not sure if this is a question to the officer or to Councillor Foster above, the application site refers to an area of garden land, and then lower down it talks about amenity space. Now, looking at the photographs when they were up, it tended to look like amenity space because you know the property simply turned its gable end and garage to the piece of land. It didn't, I know it would be nice to have seen it on site, but it didn't look like garden land, it looked like amenity space. If you look at that, and it looked very much like the kind of amenity space that certainly at that time it was very normal for developers to leave a small amount of amenity space in the centre of developments. Now, whether it's actually looked after by the two adjacent householders, as I say, looking at it, you know, it doesn't look like private land or private space attached to the adjacent property. It looks like amenity space, or as it was sometimes referred to at the time, leftover space. I don't know whether that point can be clarified. Oh, sorry.
From what I recall, if you look at where the footpath is, that land right up to the hedge were actually open land, and like you say, Councillor Swift, it was left open to give amenity space because the rest of it was so tight. At the other end, where Mrs Johnson refers to where the footpath comes in, there's quite a small area there that's at the back of the garage which has been left as amenity land as well. But the deeds, when you look at it, these pieces of amenity land are attached to properties.
Just to provide some clarification, the applicant has signed certificate A to say that they own the whole of the site. So it is, sometimes we do call an area like garden land and then we also call it amenity land or amenity space. It's amenity space and garden land owned by the occupiers of number 28.
I suppose it may not be an easy question to actually answer here and now. I suppose if I phrase the question in my head slightly differently, if I was a resident in that surrounding area, if I allowed my dog to wander onto that particular piece of ground, you know, would people feel offended by that around, or would that be regarded as a quite normal thing to do? Because, as I said, I'm using the illustration of allowing the dog to wander onto it, and if it falls into that category of amenity space within an estate, then it's quite normal for people to use it in the way I've just described. If what it actually is somebody's garden, it's just that it's open plan, then I am very much kind of encroaching onto somebody's private space. And I find myself not really very sure. As I said, looking at that photo, it looks like an awful lot of 1970s estates do, and it looks like amenity space. But I'm leaving it.
All I can say really is that, you know, the applicant signed the certificate to say that he owns the door, and I can't really comment on it. But I suppose, you know, if it's his land, if he maintains it, they keep it. So I think it's safe to say that it is land within their ownership, rather than amenity land for others to use to their benefit.
I'm not contesting for a moment the ownership, Chair. You know, I'm not contesting it's on that person's deeds. It's the actual current use of the land, you know, how it's used at the moment.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to know whether there is any extenuating circumstances for the applicant for this application.
No, they wouldn't need to provide them. I think there is something in the report that says that the lady that lives there is going to move into, would wish to move into the new dwelling, but they don't have to demonstrate any sort of special circumstances in this case, because it's not been agreed about.
Just to clarify, Julie, if that person who owns that land so wish, could he put a small fence, say minor bushes, all the way around it, and then put an application into building inside that boundary?
Planning viewpoint, yes, they could put sort of a low 1 metre high fence or wall along the front, and then 2 metre high fence or wall down the side. Whether that's something, again, that's restricted in covenants or deeds, I don't know. As a planning usually they could.
We can't do anything about the buildings, can we? We're just doing about what you can have on that piece of land.
Councillor Clark just wants something. I don't want to do that.
Chair, can we just clarify? I think Mrs Johnson can clarify the fencing issue.
As far as I understand it, the fencing was always to be maintained was it a metre level or lower than at the rear of the properties, but the front of the properties were kept open plan, so there's some restriction on whether or not people can build fences or walls at the front of the properties there on that whole development.
I don't know that it says that it has to be open plan.
I think I was just saying it's the owner's transmission and that taken by say Kelly said it's the communities.
So whatever we decide today is all on planning issues, whether we would allow somebody to put something on that piece of land.
As I said, Councillor Blizzard, you know, planning commission, piece of paper, whether you can actually implement it, you've still got to abide by any restrictive covenants or whatever. But having said that, you might have restrictive covenants, which you do on big estates, don't you? But it all relies on people enforcing those covenants and whatever. So you'd have to seek legal advice as to what your private rights are.
It's just like we put a plan application to build something on council or content in land. I would get plan permission, but I don't have to get her permission to do it.
Exactly.
So that's what we're saying.
Yeah.
Any further questions, officers? And actually,
Leave now.
the officer's recommendations there for approval. Do I have that moved?
Moved, Chair.
Seconded? In favour? Against? 1, 2, 3. Abstentions? No, that's fair.
So you need to do the motion.
No, we need a motion from the floor.
Chair, can I move refusal, Chair? And subject to discussion from other members, I would move refusal on the grounds of traffic impact on the head of that cul-de-sac and the loss of amenity space.
So, the goes to vote there.
Need a second.
Yeah. Need a seconder? So now we're going for the motion put forward as refusal on the grounds of community space and traffic. The vote, please.
You want votes in favour?
It's up to you, yeah, you'll put the motion forward. 1, 2, 3, 4. Against? 1, 3. And abstentions? Now we need all the reasons of why.
Well, I think Councillor has given the reasons there, hasn't he? So unless there's any other reasons, but I think the reasons are loss of amenity land and traffic impact, isn't it?
Those are the reasons in mind.
Right.
I can see what you're saying about, traffic and once it's built, there'll only be a possible 2 cars. Amenity space, anybody's amenity space is the person who owns that dwelling, it's their land. They could say to anybody, and I don't think that's stand up.
I think in terms of, when we talk about loss of amenity space, would it, because the land belongs to the occupier, is it more that you think it will affect the character of the character of that area? In that I'm just a bit worried about loss of amenity space because it's their garden.
Leaving aside the fact that we have actually voted on it, leaving that minor matter on one side, I put it in deliberately vague terms, and that was my choice of words. And the choice of words was because I think the indications from the evidence was that it is amenity land. I mean, all pieces of land are owned by somebody. And just because the adjacent householder owns it doesn't mean it isn't amenity space. So on balance, and I tried to clarify it, on balance I thought that the evidence was that was amenity space. Other people can take a different view. And that was why I moved the motion I did in the words that I used. I fully accept that there is a lack of clarity, a lack of certainty about the status of that piece of land. Now, I would have liked us to have been able to take a decision on a more certain situation, but to me, looking at the photos, that land looks like I can think of dozens of pieces of land, particularly in the old South Ward I used to represent, where there was lots of 1970s development, and an awful lot of land tucked on the end of houses around the end of cul-de-sacs that looked exactly like that. Looking at that, there's no evidence that that land is used as part of the garden of an adjacent house. That's the way it looks. Now, as I say, I do accept that there's a lack of certainty about it. And indeed, that lack of certainty, I think, is reflected in the wording of the report, where a paragraph starts off referring to it as garden land, and then before the paragraph is finished, it refers to it as amenity space. Now, so I think there's obviously there's an ambiguity in the mind of the person drafting the report. I can go no further. As I say, I worded my motion of refusal in the way I did for the reasons I've just explained, and I would wish I could have been more certain about it.
Can I just bring there, Chair?
Yeah.
Obviously, you've voted to refuse it. You've got to come up with solid planning reasons that are defensible at any appeal. There is something in the Planning Members Code of Conduct that where you're a bit hazy about if I can put it like that, about the reasons, then you can, put it as minded to refuse, subject to those reasons, and that the matter be deferred to the next meeting for the officers to assess whether those reasons are defensible. Now, there was the loss of the amenity land, but there was also traffic impact. Are you able to, is somebody able to elaborate on that?
Well, it's my reason, and I'll tell you why. But the evidence put forward by all...
Well, it's the committee's reason by...
Yes, indeed, okay. But we're all in the... Looking at the evidence on the plan, you've got a little turning head, and then I know from all the little turning heads I've ever encountered that if you've got a load of houses clustered around the top end, you end up with congestion. Now those turning heads, it's supposed to be where people can actually reverse. So if you occupy on a relatively narrow estate road, if you occupy the full length of all the curves with parked cars, or a lot of it, then people find difficulty turning. Those problems are accentuated these days when we have the sheer number of medium to large delivery vehicles that we do. So that the requirement for clear road space is now a lot more than it was several years back. Now, I appreciate that they show, a driveway with two cars. I also know well, again, from the experience that we all have, that an awful lot of people do not like parking two cars on one driveway. They put one car on the driveway and they put the other car on the street so they can get in and out. So certainly, I don't know what other members of other own views, but certainly, and we had support from that view from Councillor Foster and I do apologise that the lady who spoke, who said that it was frequently congested at the head of that cul-de-sac, as it is at the moment. So we're taking away land which is alleged to be associated with one dwelling, so they have reduced land, and we then add another property which is dependent on fairly tight driveway parking. So, the one thing that's absolutely certain is that the traffic situation at the head of that little cul-de-sac, it gets worse. Nobody could argue that the addition of an additional property there would not increase the traffic pressures on that bit. Now, all right, how much it increases those pressures, whether it increases those pressures to the degree to which the problems it causes, and so forth, is a matter of judgment. I'll shut up. Those are the opinions.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I'll go first. Thank you, Chair. So my reason for the refusal is there is a right of way to access at the front of 2028. So 30 does not exist. Well, 30 is, next to 28, would assuming and with this part of land whether it's a new community or not, but people have access to it. So once a new property is being built, the access to the front of that is no longer, exist. So I wonder whether that's the reason that we should refuse it as well.
I would say no, because we are providing access to outside is what we've got now, so that would, alright. They would still have an access around to get down to the back.
With that drawings,
yeah, there would still be access down there, because that's what the trees because there's still an access route around back, there will still be a meter access down the side to the back. So Castle is not going to do one because it is.
Yeah, so the 20 to 28, the front of the 20 to 28, we can have
the front
access.
is there anyway, so what we're saying is the access will go down the side and around the back. Councillor Haynes?
I'm going to suggest that the proposed design is harmful to the established street scene and the accepted use, the long time accepted use of the layout of the development. And the parking, there's no provision for garaging, and the parking of cars on the drive will add to the already congested traffic problems within that cul-de-sac. It's a long time established development. It's a long time established, and the amenity of the street scene has been accepted for a long period of time, and this has a detrimental effect on the overall appearance of the. That has a direct effect on the amenity of everybody who lives there.
Just jump in.
Yes.
fine with it. Yeah, so there's two ways of doing this. You could say, right, we've given our reasons, we're content with our reasons, straightforward refusal. Or the other way of doing it, which you're entitled to do, is say, minded refuse those reasons, we want them tested, and then come back ready to endorse them or not. So it's a matter for the committee really. You think that you've got sufficient reasons, they're defensible, then you might be minded to give it outright refusal. But that's entitled, you know, a matter for the committee really.
Yeah, I think we've done the decisions on it. I lost it, one type of thing. But just to put my point of view forward, if a farmer hires this field out to somebody who has horses, and then all of a sudden this farmer doesn't want horses on that field no more, so he takes them away and does a crop. It's only like what this guy's done. It's been an amenity, as you think it is, for the estate, but now he wants to do something with it. It's his piece of land, and as long as he's within planning laws, I don't think we can stop him from doing that, as long as he keeps the planning laws. And that's why I voted for it. What we've decided now is fine. But I'm just letting Kevin know that's where I go about it.
See, in terms of the status of the, let's split the thing in two. I think we're all perfectly capable of forming a view as to whether or not we think that traffic congestion at the head of that little cul-de-sac is a bad thing or not. And I don't think kind of deferring that on a kind of minded to would make much difference. Now, on the other hand, the factual uncertainty about the status of that piece of land, if that factual uncertainty could, if there's some chance of resolving that, then I think that, subject to the views of colleagues, I think there's a lot to be said for following Kevin's suggested option on that and deferring it to see if we can actually clarify the status.
Kevin, 1 second. Kevin has just said he's quite happy to defer it for the next committee to look at the amenity space, i.e. garden, to this property to clarify if it is garden or if it is amenity space for the resident.
Well, I don't know to say the planning officer do that, because I don't know if it's got any planning status or something.
I don't know if we can clarify whether it's community space for the estate or whether it's their garden land. The applicant might be able to provide some information, but to us, when we talk about amenity land and amenity space, it means much the same thing in planning terms when we're looking at something like this. It's like the RDG talks about, properties having to have 75 square metres of amenity space. That's garden. So I don't really know if we would be able to sort of define that and clarify it for you. Whether the applicant might be able to, I don't know. But I know, I 100% understand what you're saying, but in planning terms, garden space and amenity space is the same thing.
And you can have that applicant and say, well, yeah, that's my garden, that's my amenity space, not anybody else's on that estate.
Which is what I said in the correspondence. Sorry, what we could do, because if it did go through here, the inspector would take the application details to put it on face value. What we seem to be debating is whether it's a private garden amenity space or public amenity space. Is it available for public use or is it for private use? Because if we're talking about private amenity space garden, in planning terms, would you be having this debate if we wanted an extension to the site to extend the living accommodation, for example? So we can ask the question, is this public amenity space, or you may own it, but is it for public use or is it for private use? And we can clarify that aspect, because I think if that was to be tested at appeal, there is some differences there in an inspector review that. Because there's a wind back the clock a bit. If you're having this debate over a domestic extension to the side and you converted the garage to an extended living room, would you be raising the same issues? But we can clarify.
Yeah, I might be able to. The applicant actually wrote, when they saw the objections that we received, they actually wrote and they said, just to clarify, the intended plot has always been on my deeds from 1976 from you, and as on everyone else's deeds, it's my property's garden and not some shared open area.
Not contesting for a moment that it's on their deeds, yeah? They are, I mean, every bit of land anywhere is on somebody's deeds. Probably the land underneath the tarmac on Wood Street will be in some, probably is on somebody's deeds, but it doesn't stop it being a public highway. You know, so I'm not arguing, I'm not contesting it's on his deeds.
Well, I went to that weekend because I had to ask you to put this back up because I don't see it. Look at this bit. It's fenced off right from the front. So there is an access to the side of that building. Because that is fenced up for his back garden.
She's quite clear, it's quite clear in what she's saying. She said it's her property's garden and not some shared area.
Yeah.
My garden is my garden and not some parkland to be inhabited by others. My garden could have been fenced off, but it was my mother and I who decided to leave it open until recently. It is my garden after all.
Her neighbours might say something different.
Sam,
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to page 94. So we are talking about all the factors will affect the outcome of this, but which we have voted on already. So the policy E9 requires all new development to make a positive contribution to the neighbourhood, to the environment and unities of locality. But by that virtue, this is not. So especially we're looking at previously the outlook, the residential unity, and that 7 metres Councillor Haynes also mentioned. So I don't think that we need just to point out one overall the balance for the 4 members voting for objection is not just for one reason, I would say.
I think the committee voted to refuse this, and I think we should go with the reasons that have been offered to Julie.
I abstained because I don't like it, but I couldn't think of reasons that I could be confident that would stand up. So that's the reason I abstained. It's not, you know, I'm either way, if I could have thought of a reason that I was certain would stand up to scrutiny, then I would have voted against it.
the decision been made, so you decided to go for refusal and not.
Just out of curiosity, Chair, you'll let us know what happens.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, everyone. That is the end of the